Greetings, programs, and welcome to another edition of Thumb Wars Presents Blistered Reviews. This time around, we're taking a look at Nintendo's latest 3DS offering, Yoshi's New Island. Does this game live up to its illustrious predecessors, or is it bad enough to ruin the appetite of even the most cast-iron bottomless stomach? To begin with, Yoshi's New Island is easily the worst Mario-related platformer released in over a decade. This is not to say the game is outright bad or poorly made, and you'll not have to search long to find dozens and dozens of platformers on the 3DS alone that are of a significantly lower quality than New Island. Indeed, I would even say that judged against the larger field of platformers as a whole, the game actually rates above average. The problem is that the level of quality for Nintendo platformers, and especially Mario-based ones, is simply so high, and along with some touching motion controls and weak production values, it ends up leaving Yoshi's New Island as the low dinosaur on the totem pole as far as new releases this month goes. The good: regular controls, basic gameplay, top screen action only. The bad: difficulty, motion controls, two-player minigames, visuals, audio. The ugly: listening to the overworld map music for extended periods may be hazardous for one's mental health. The setup for New Island frames the game as an interquel between Yoshi's Island and Yoshi's Island DS, with the hand-wave justification for all this revolving around the stork initially delivering the Mario babies to the wrong house at the end of the original 1996 game. Unfortunately, along the way to Mario and Luigi's actual home, Mr. Stork is intercepted again by Kamek and his crew, and now a virtual army of Yoshis must once more take up the cause of carrying baby Mario on their backs as they attempt to traverse the oh-so-cleverly named Egg Island and track down baby Luigi's captors. It's an utterly familiar setup, which is not in and of itself a problem, since people rarely play Mario platformers for their deep, meaningful stories. But the slapdash and half-hearted execution of said story is really indicative of a larger problem with the game. That problem is that Yoshi's New Island brings as little new to the table in terms of gameplay production values as it does narrative. For one thing, the new additions to the game, such as various giant eggs and some new obstacle types, all feel rather token and underused when all is said and done. Certainly, there's nothing as interesting or in-depth as the additions of the new babies that were a centerpiece of Yoshi's Island DS, for example. Similarly, the changes in the implementation to Yoshi's signature vehicle transformations now have such moments occurring separate from the main action of a given level, which in turn essentially gives them the feel of poorly thought-out minigames. In the past, the new Super Mario Bros. Sub-series has gotten something of a bum rap for being lazy regurgitations of a well-established formula. And while those games are certainly formulaic, I've never agreed that this is necessarily a bad thing. That's because each NSMB game has, in my opinion at least, managed to implement enough new additions to the formula to prevent the games from feeling like mere reruns of past hits. Certainly, none of the NSMB titles have ever matched, much less exceeded, Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World, but considering those are two of the greatest platformers ever made, that's no great crime. What really matters is that each NSMB game can stand on its own merits, but even when judged apart from the past Yoshi games, New Island still too often falls short. For one thing, the required use of motion controls via tilting the 3DS for the aforementioned vehicle segments causes them to range from uninteresting to outright infuriating. And frankly, this choice is without question one of the game's biggest missteps. This feels like the kind of poor developer thinking left behind in the DS era of gaming, and frankly, its inclusion in New Island is bewildering. I can only chalk it up to the fact that New Island is the first full game from developer Arzest, but that's a cold comfort when being forced to redo a vehicle section for the 10th time thanks to poor motion controls. To be fair, in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay, Yoshi's New Island gets everything more or less right, with the game's standard controls in particular being as rock-solid as one would hope from a Nintendo-published platformer. Also, there are times when the game does manage to actually pull off some legitimately clever touches, such as a set of reoccurring optional challenges that have players trying to guide an evil doppelganger of Yoshi who matches his movements to a set of spikes. Plus, the basic run, jump, eat, shoot formula remains as fun and engaging now as it did back in 1995 on the SNES, and avoids the more awkward moments from Yoshi's Island DS, caused by splitting the action between two screens simultaneously and leaving an unseen area for players to constantly have to deal with. Keeping the action restricted to the top screen only was clearly the right way to go in this case, and one example of where New Island does indeed improve on its immediate predecessor. If only the same could be said for the game's boss battles, whose generally clever and interesting setups are undercut by how short and easy most of these conflicts end up being. It's just another example of New Island having some interesting ideas, but falling short when it comes to their execution. I regret nothing! Speaking of a lack of challenge, much of the time spent with New Island will offer most players little difficulty, even by the more admittedly lax standards of the NSMB subseries. This is further compounded by the game giving out extra lives like candy, to the point that by the time I'd reached the end of the 4th level of the game's first world, I'd managed to pick up 40 lives with a minimum of extra effort. Now, that being said, the game does start to pick up in difficulty during Worlds 5 and 6, i.e. its last 2 worlds, and also, the often tricky proposition of acquiring every collectible in a game, where one such collectible decreases in number any time a player takes a hit, remains palpable. Still, even for those interested in such collecting, it's hard for me to imagine the game taking more than 8 hours to complete, and indeed, it only took me 5 hours to reach the closing credits of New Island, and I am far from the best speedrunner you will ever find. Of course, whether or not a game was long enough can be very subjective, but still, that's an awfully iffy period of time for a game this easy to begin with, and that's currently being sold at a price tag of $40. Perhaps such a ratio of time spent versus money spent would be more bearable if Yoshi's New Island offered amazing production values for players to enjoy. But in point of fact, these are the areas where the game arguably drops the ball the worst. While New Island employs the same crown-drawing-like visual aesthetic of past Yoshi Island titles, the simple truth is that visually the game is remarkably bland for the majority of its runtime. Indeed, during the game's first 4 worlds, levels more often than not tend to blend into one another, and the charm and whimsy of the original Yoshi's Island feels largely absent from this new edition. Again, things do pick up a bit in New Island's later 2 worlds, but it's largely a case, at that point, of too little, too late. On the music front, the game fails even harder, with nary a memorable tune present, and instead music tracks in New Island generally swing between sleep-inducing and outright annoying, which is all the more shocking considering how amazing the music in the original Yoshi's Island was. Chalk it up to Arzest's inexperience once again, I suspect. I want to be clear, Yoshi's New Island is not the worst game I've ever played. Indeed, it's not even a bad game, and for all my complaints, I did have fun the majority of time while playing it. The problem is that it was fun in the same way that fast food is a meal. Both will more or less meet your needs at the time, but a week later it's unlikely you'll look back with fond memories at the amazing taste you experienced, assuming you can remember said meal at all at that point. What developer Arzest has produced might technically recreate the basics of the Yoshi's Island formula, but it does so at the expense of the creativity and style that made the original an instant classic in the first place. I hope the company can learn from its mistakes here, because it feels like they really do have it in them to produce a truly great platformer that fans can enjoy. For now, though, Yoshi's New Island is a largely forgettable addition to the Mario library, and those hoping for an exciting new romp with the green dinosaur with a long tongue and a bottomless stomach will simply have to keep holding on until Yarn Yoshi eventually is released for the Wii U. In the meantime, only those desperate for their Yoshi fix, or anyone who has already played games like Rayman Legends and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze to death, should even consider bothering with Yoshi's New Island. A game that really is a case of so close, yet still so far. Score, 6 out of 10, above average. Recommendation, for fans only.